The road to Caldwell Manor was paved in silence. No bird sang, no insect stirred in the brittle grass that lined the drive. The trees, blackened and skeletal, leaned inward as if to whisper secrets to the wind. The house itself loomed at the hill's crest, a monstrous shape against a colorless sky, its windows gleaming faintly with the last light of dusk. In the year 1874, the Caldwell family arrived in the small, wind-bitten town of Brackenridge, a place forgotten by maps and memory alike. They came from the east, rich, ambitious, and unsatisfied with the wealth they already possessed. Nathaniel Caldwell, the patriarch, was a man known for his unrelenting vision, a man who built mills, factories, and entire towns from the bones of others' failures. When he first laid eyes on the barren expanse known as Black Hollow, he saw not desolation but opportunity. The land stretched for miles, an uneven quilt of dead trees and pale soil that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. To Nathaniel, it was the perfect foundation for a legacy that would outlast time itself. To the townspeople, it was a graveyard that should never be disturbed. Black Hollow was not listed in any official records, though everyone in Brackenridge knew its name. Some said it was once a burial ground for settlers lost during the Hollow Winter of 1812, a famine so cruel that families had turned on one another in desperation. Others whispered that it was older still, sacred to the tribes who had once roamed the land, a place where the veil between life and death grew thin. Whatever its origin, the hollow carried a reputation of ill fate. No crops would grow there, no animals would graze, and no one who set foot within its borders stayed for long. But when Nathaniel Caldwell offered gold and silver for the property, enough to tempt even the most superstitious, the townsfolk signed their names and crossed themselves, muttering that the land would take what was owed, one way or another. When the Caldwells took ownership, they arrived in grandeur, a caravan of carriages, crates, and servants trailing through the mist like a parade of ghosts. Nathaniel's wife, Margaret, was delicate, her beauty marred only by the constant tremor of unease that crossed her face when she looked toward the hollow. Their 3 children, Eleanor, Jonathan, and young Henry, watched from the carriage windows with wide, curious eyes. To them, the hollow seemed strange but thrilling, a place waiting to be conquered. As the family's horses crossed onto the property, the air grew still, and the echo of hooves fell flat against the ground, swallowed by the silence that lingered there. The servants would later say the moment felt like crossing into another world. The first night the Caldwells stayed at the nearby inn, a violent storm swept through Brackenridge. Lightning struck the hills, illuminating the hollow in sharp, fleeting flashes. In those moments of brilliance, some townsfolk claimed they saw shapes moving through the fog, figures hunched and pale, dragging themselves through the wet earth as if trying to climb free. The next morning, when Nathaniel visited the site with his surveyor, the ground seemed oddly disturbed, riddled with deep cracks and holes that hadn't been there before. The surveyor remarked it looked like the land had breathed during the storm, expanding and contracting like a living thing. Nathaniel only laughed and waved it off as erosion. He refused to see the warnings in front of him. Word spread quickly that the Caldwells had begun their project, and workers from nearby towns were recruited to break the ground and prepare the foundation. Dozens of men arrived, carrying shovels, picks, and the heavy stench of whiskey to dull their nerves. The first week passed without incident, though the workers complained of strange sounds, low murmurs rising from the soil, soft enough to make them doubt their own ears. By the second week, a man named Eli Tuck disappeared. His shovel was found near the edge of a trench, its metal slick with moisture, but no trace of Eli himself was ever seen again. Nathaniel doubled the wages for anyone willing to stay, and greed triumphed over fear. The digging continued. As the foundation deepened, the whispers grew louder. Some swore they heard crying at night, others claimed to see faint glows beneath the dirt. When one of the foremen unearthed what he thought were animal bones, a laborer corrected him. They were human, small and curved, like the bones of a child. Nathaniel ordered the remains reburied at once, dismissing it as a remnant of old settlers. But the workers didn't believe him. By the time the stone layers began, half the crew had vanished, either quitting or disappearing outright. The remaining men stopped sleeping near the hollow. They refused to touch the ground after sunset, saying it pulsed faintly beneath their feet, as though the earth itself was alive and watching. Margaret Caldwell began keeping a journal around that time. Her entries, later discovered in the ruins of the manor, described her husband's obsession with completing the project. He spent his days among the laborious, his nights drawing plans by candlelight. Nathaniel believes this land is his legacy, she wrote. But I fear it will consume him. I hear the wind whispering through the hills, and it speaks his name. She mentioned their children growing pale and sleepless, tormented by nightmares of hands reaching from the soil to pull them under. The youngest, Henry, refused to go near the construction site. He claimed to see faces in the earth, faces that moved. One night, near the end of autumn, Margaret awoke to find Nathaniel missing. She followed the flicker of a lantern down the path to the hollow, where she found him standing knee-deep in the trench, speaking softly to the ground as though in prayer. When she called out, he turned with a distant expression and told her the strangest thing, that the land was listening, that it understood him, that they had reached an agreement. She never asked what he meant, and he never spoke of it again. By the following spring, the foundation was complete. Massive slabs of limestone rose from the ground like the bones of a buried creature. The manor skeleton took form, sharp and deliberate against the grey horizon. The people of Brackenridge kept their distance, crossing themselves whenever they passed the property. A few dared to watch from afar as the Caldwells stood proudly before their rising house. Nathaniel smiled that day, declaring that the hollow would finally serve the living. But those who were there swore they saw something move beneath the soil as he spoke, a ripple, a subtle shift, like something turning in its sleep beneath the weight of stone and pride. The construction of Caldwell Manor began with an air of triumph and inevitability, as though Nathaniel Caldwell had already claimed victory over the land before the first stone was laid. To him, Black Hollow was a challenge, a wild, untamed thing that would soon bow to the precision of architecture and industry. He hired the finest masons and craftsmen from across the state, promising them wages that far exceeded what any of them could earn elsewhere. He spoke of legacy, of the great house that would stand for generations, a symbol of the Caldwell name etched in stone. But those who came to work soon realized there was something wrong about the place, something the money could not soften. The ground itself resisted them. Tools dulled faster than they should have. Stones cracked as if under invisible pressure. And when the men struck their picks into the soil, the sound it made was never hollow, it was deep, resonant, almost as if it were striking something alive. At first, Nathaniel ignored the whispers. He was not a man easily frightened, and he believed fear was a disease that spread quickly among men with idle hands. When one of the masons claimed he saw movement in the corner of his eye, a shadow rising and sinking back into the ground, Nathaniel ordered him off the site, calling him superstitious. When another complained that the nights were filled with faint, rhythmic noises beneath the earth, like the beating of a heart, Nathaniel doubled the night guards to keep watch. Yet the guards themselves began to change. They stood closer to the fires, muttering prayers under their breath. One quit in the middle of his shift, saying the sound wasn't a heart at all, it was a voice trying to crawl its way up through the dirt. Despite the growing unease, the manor began to take form. Limestone walls rose from the hollow like pale ribs, and the scaffolding creaked day and night under the labor of men who no longer sang as they worked. Margaret Caldwell often watched from the carriages that brought supplies from town, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She noticed how her husband's eyes grew darker each day, how his temper shortened and his speech became distant, as though he were listening to something far away. When she tried to speak with him about the workers' fears, he would only smile faintly and say, "They are hearing the cost of greatness." She didn't understand what he meant, but his voice carried a kind of reverence that unsettled her. It wasn't long before the first true accident occurred. A scaffolding beam, newly secured that morning, came loose and fell upon two workers below, crushing one instantly and leaving the other delirious. Before dying at dawn, the survivor raved about, eyes beneath the stone, staring at him, waiting. Nathaniel buried the incident with money, paying the widows handsomely to leave town and never speak of it again. But rumors traveled faster than coin could silence them. Men began to quit in groups, refusing to stay another night in the hollow. New laborers were brought in, but the same pattern repeated, first the whispers, then the sightings, then the sudden departures. The remaining workers began describing strange phenomena. The sound of hammers echoed even after the day's work had ended. Tools left neatly by the foundation were found buried deep in the soil by morning, as if swallowed whole. Sometimes, faint humming could be heard emanating from the lowest sections of the manor, where the foundation met the untouched ground. The men said it wasn't wind or stone, but voices, countless ones, murmuring in unison. Nathaniel forbade anyone to speak of it, and in defiance of their fear, he ordered construction to continue through the night. He began working late himself, pacing the incomplete halls by lamplight, touching the stone as if feeling for a heartbeat beneath it. Margaret wrote often to her sister in those days, her letters increasingly fragmented and desperate. She described hearing the same voices her husband dismissed, whispering through the floorboards of their temporary quarters. She wrote of finding footprints on the steps at dawn, muddy prints that led from the construction site straight to her window. Her children had grown restless and pale, refusing to sleep, waking with scratches on their hands and faces. Eleanor says she dreams of people under the ground, she wrote once. Not dead, but waiting. I hear them, too, when the wind falls still. The letters were never sent. Nathaniel discovered them one morning and burned them in the hearth, saying the house must not be poisoned with fear. By midsummer, the mansion's frame towered above the hollow, its shadow stretching long and dark over the fields. Nathaniel stood before it each evening, studying the structure with a look of deep satisfaction, though his face had grown gaunt and pale. Some nights, he spoke aloud to the house as though it could hear him. Servants began to whisper that their master had made some sort of pact, that the land had offered him something in exchange for its obedience. One of the oldest workers, a stonemason named Clive Merrin, confronted him after finding fresh cracks in the foundation. He warned that the stones were shifting from below, that the earth was pushing back. Nathaniel dismissed him, but Merrin persisted, saying he could feel something pulsing under the stone. The next morning, Merrin was gone. His tools were found near the cellar steps, his lantern still burning. The men worked in silence after that. Not a single whistle, laugh, or song rose above the noise of hammer and stone. When dusk fell, they left without looking back, huddling in small groups and refusing to speak of what they'd seen. Some claimed to hear knocking from inside the walls, though the house was unfinished. Others swore they saw handprints appear on the mortar while they worked, as though something inside the walls was trying to press its way out. When the last stone was laid and the scaffolding torn down, the Caldwell family moved in without ceremony. Nathaniel stood on the grand staircase that night, gazing out at the hollow through the towering windows. He said the land was finally tamed, that the debt of history had been paid in full. But as he spoke, a faint tremor rippled through the foundation, almost imperceptible, like the slow exhale of something ancient stirring beneath their feet. The candles flickered. The walls seemed to breathe. And for the first time since the manor's completion, Margaret thought she heard the ground whisper again, but this time, it wasn't warning them to stop. It was welcoming them home. The night of the Red Banquet began with thunder rolling low across the hills, the kind that seemed to crawl beneath the skin rather than echo through the air. The manor had been standing only 6 months, but already it had taken on a life of its own. The servants moved quietly through its corridors, their faces pale and their eyes avoiding the long, black windows that reflected no light. Still, Nathaniel Caldwell had declared that the grand opening of his home would not be postponed. The invitations had been sent weeks in advance to every notable family within 100 miles, promising a night of luxury, music, and celebration. It was to be, he said, the evening that cemented the Caldwell name into history. By sundown, the carriages began to arrive, their lanterns flickering weakly in the mist that clung to the hollow. The guests, nearly 50 in number, entered the manor with cautious awe. The great hall was a cathedral of marble and shadow, the chandeliers dripping with crystal and candlelight. Portraits of the Caldwell ancestors, hastily commissioned for the occasion, watched from the walls, their painted eyes gleaming faintly in the glow. Music floated through the air, soft and melancholic, as if the violinist played for an unseen audience. Margaret Caldwell, adorned in crimson silk, stood beside her husband, smiling as she greeted each guest, though her hand trembled around the stem of her glass. She had begged Nathaniel to postpone the banquet. There were cracks in the basement stone, she said, and the house groaned at night like a living thing. But Nathaniel only laughed, insisting the sounds were the song of settling foundations, nothing more than the house finding its voice. As the storm deepened outside, the manor sealed itself in warmth and firelight. The guests dined in the great hall, seated before a table that stretched nearly the length of the room. Dishes of roasted pheasant, glazed fruit, and spiced wine filled the air with heavy fragrance. Laughter rose and fell like the flicker of flames, yet beneath it, there was something strange, an unease that no one could quite name. Some guests later described a faint vibration running through the floorboards, a tremor that matched the rhythm of their heartbeat. The candles wavered in unison, though there was no breeze. The chandelier above the table swayed ever so slightly, its crystals chiming with an almost deliberate cadence. Midway through the meal, a sound interrupted the music, a low, drawn-out groan that came from somewhere beneath the hall. The violinist stopped playing. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Then Nathaniel rose, glass in hand, and announced it was merely the wind echoing through the stone corridors. He raised his cup, proposing a toast to prosperity, to family, and to the house that would stand for eternity. The guests laughed and drank, eager to shake off the discomfort, but Margaret could not join them. She stared at the far wall, at a dark patch that had begun to spread near the baseboards. It looked like moisture seeping through the stone, but the color was wrong, too deep, too red. When she blinked, it seemed to pulse. As the night wore on, the rain turned to a torrent. Lightning flashed through the high windows, illuminating the hall in jagged bursts. Servants moved hurriedly between courses, their expressions strained. One whispered to another that the cellar door had swung open on its own. Another claimed to have heard footsteps descending the servants' stairwell, though everyone accounted for was already in the dining room. Nathaniel ignored them all, insisting that no storm, no superstition, would ruin his moment of triumph. He ordered the music to continue, his voice sharp and commanding. But the violinist refused to play again. His bow hand shook, and his eyes were fixed on the large mirror at the end of the hall. It was there that he saw it first, the faint reflection of someone standing behind him. There was no one there. The lights flickered once, twice, then held. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the manor itself were inhaling. The guests tried to carry on, forcing laughter, sipping nervously at their wine. Then came a sharp sound, the unmistakable crack of glass. A goblet shattered in one woman's hand, cutting deep into her skin. Blood spilled across the white linen, and as it did, every candle in the room extinguished at once. The hall fell into darkness. Gasps echoed through the room, followed by the scrape of chairs. Margaret's voice broke the silence, trembling and small. "Nathaniel, something's wrong." But her husband didn't answer. The thunder outside roared in reply, and in its wake came a sound from below, a deep, rhythmic pounding that rose through the floors, shaking the plates and silverware. Someone screamed. The great chandelier swayed violently, its crystals raining sparks as the candles relit themselves in a sudden burst of flame. But the firelight revealed a horror none could deny: the walls were bleeding. Thick, dark streaks seeped from between the stones, running down in rivulets, staining the portraits and curtains. The guests backed away, their faces pale and shining with sweat. The violinist dropped his instrument and fled toward the door, only to find it locked. One by one, the guests turned to Nathaniel. He stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the far wall where the red stain had spread into a wide, blooming pattern. Then the floor beneath him shuddered. The pounding grew louder, closer, until the tiles at his feet cracked. Margaret screamed as the boards buckled, and something beneath them began to rise. A smell of rot filled the air, so thick it made them gag. The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, Nathaniel was gone. Where he had stood, there was now only a dark hole yawning open in the center of the floor, the edges slick with something that shimmered in the light. Panic erupted. Guests ran for the doors, clawing at the locks, pounding on the walls. Windows refused to break, as though the glass had hardened into something stronger than stone. The storm raged outside, but the sound of the rain was drowned by the noise from beneath the house, whispers, countless and overlapping, rising into a dreadful chorus. The last thing anyone remembered before the lights went out completely was the tolling of the dinner bell. It rang 3 times, clear and deliberate, echoing through the hollow. When morning came, the storm had passed. The manor stood silent and immaculate, its windows gleaming faintly under the grey dawn. The dining room appeared untouched, the table still set as it had been the night before. But every guest was gone. The chairs were neatly arranged, the food unspoiled, the wine still half full in crystal glasses. Only one thing marked that something had happened. At the center of the long oak table, pressed deep into the grain, was a single blackened handprint. It was burned into the wood, as though seared there by something too hot to belong to this world. Decades passed before anyone dared to set foot inside Caldwell Manor again. The townsfolk avoided the hollow entirely, steering their wagons miles around it even when it meant adding hours to their journeys. The manor stood untouched, slowly decaying under the weight of time and weather. Its once grand walls were draped in ivy, and the long drive leading to its gate had been swallowed by moss and weeds. Yet no one in Brackenridge spoke of tearing it down. It was said that those who tried, trespassers, drunks, or daring youth, never came back. Some nights, when the wind howled just right, the faint echo of a dinner bell could still be heard across the valley. The elders would close their doors and warn the children not to listen too long, for the house was known to call to those who paid it too much attention. The Caldwells had vanished without a trace, but their name remained a ghost story told in hushed tones around tavern tables and winter fires. It was in the early spring of 1910 when the last of the Caldwell bloodline returned. Henry Caldwell, a man of 40 with streaks of grey in his hair and the hollowed eyes of someone long haunted, arrived in Brackenridge unannounced. He was the youngest son, barely a boy on the night of the Red Banquet. He had been sent away to boarding school in the city days before the event and had lived his life under the shadow of that unspoken tragedy. Rumors about his family followed him wherever he went, stories of madness, curses, and disappearances. For years, he refused to acknowledge any of it. But time had not been kind to Henry. His fortune had dwindled, his health had faltered, and his nights were plagued by dreams of his family standing in the great hall, their faces pale and still, their eyes fixed on him as though waiting. When the last of his wealth was gone, he said he would return home. He claimed he needed to understand what had happened in that house and why it had never let them go. When Henry stepped through the rusted gates of Caldwell Manor, the silence that met him felt almost sentient. The air was colder within the hollow than beyond its borders, and the earth seemed to pulse faintly underfoot, as though remembering the steps of those long gone. The manor loomed ahead, its windows clouded and black, its doors hanging loosely on their hinges. He carried only a lantern and a small case of tools, his intention not merely to visit but to restore. He had written to contractors, though none agreed to come. They knew the stories. In the end, he decided to work alone, sleeping in a small tent just outside the manor's entrance. The first night passed without incident, though the wind carried whispers that made the canvas of his tent shiver. On the second day, Henry entered the house fully for the first time. Dust lay thick upon every surface, and the air smelled faintly of iron and decay. The grand hall was almost perfectly preserved despite the years, chairs still upright, dishes still arranged neatly on the table. His lantern caught the glint of silverware and glass untouched by rust. It was as though time itself had been halted inside the walls. At the far end of the hall, he found the burn mark, the blackened handprint seared deep into the oak. He touched it without thinking, and the air around him shifted. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked. He turned sharply, the lantern's flame sputtering. But nothing moved. Henry began his restoration work in the days that followed. He boarded the broken windows, scrubbed the floors, and cleared the hallways of debris. Yet each night, as darkness fell, the sounds returned. Faint thuds in the distance, whispering too soft to decipher, footsteps pacing the upper floors when he knew he was alone. He told himself it was the wind, or the old house settling, but deep down he knew better. The more he worked, the stronger the feeling grew, that the house was watching him, waiting. Sometimes, when he glanced up at the dusty portraits lining the staircase, he thought the eyes had changed direction, following him as he moved. Once, while cleaning the mirrors in the drawing room, he saw a reflection behind him, a figure standing in the doorway, its shape tall and indistinct. When he turned, there was no one there. After a week, the real horror began. While repairing the lower cellar stairs, Henry discovered that the foundation walls were wet, though there had been no rain. He pressed his palm against the stone, and his fingers came away red. The liquid was thick, metallic in scent. He stepped back, heart pounding, and watched as the seepage spread across the mortar lines, trickling down to the floor in thin streams. The ground beneath his boots felt soft, almost like flesh. When he knelt to examine it closer, he heard something, faint, rhythmic, coming from below. It was the same sound that had haunted his dreams since childhood, a slow, deliberate knocking, like someone tapping from beneath the floorboards. That night, Henry could not sleep. He lit a fire and sat before it, clutching his lantern even after the flame burned low. Near midnight, the whispering began again, clearer now. It was not the indistinct murmur he'd heard before, but words, his name, repeated softly, as though coaxing him toward something. He rose, trembling, and stepped toward the grand hall. The candles he'd left unlit were now burning, their flame steady and unmoving despite the draught. The long table was set once more, every plate and cup gleaming. He smelled wine, freshly poured, and heard the faint scrape of a chair being pulled back. His hands shook as he lifted the lantern. At the far end of the table sat a figure, its features obscured by shadow. Then, slowly, it looked up. Henry stumbled backward, the lantern falling from his grasp. The flame flickered out, plunging him into darkness. He could still hear the voices, dozens of them now, whispering from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath him. They weren't angry, they were pleading. He could make out fragments of phrases, words like return, beneath, and blood. When he regained his senses enough to light another match, the room was empty again. But the wine glasses were no longer full. Each had been drained, and in the bottom of every cup was the faint smear of something darker than wine. In the morning, he tried to flee. But when he reached the gates, they would not open. The iron bars were cold and unmoving, their hinges fused as though melted. He called out, his voice echoing through the hollow, but no one answered. Exhausted and terrified, Henry returned to the house, determined to understand. He descended once more into the cellar, this time following the sound of the whispers. The red seepage had thickened overnight, pooling in the cracks of the stone floor. He knelt, pressed his ear to the ground, and heard a voice so clear it could not be mistaken. It was his father's, calling from below, saying the same words he had heard as a child in his dreams: "The debt must be paid, Henry. The house remembers." And then the ground beneath him moved. When the truth finally revealed itself, it did not come as a sudden terror but as a slow and dreadful understanding that spread through Henry like a sickness. He had been in Caldwell Manor for nearly a month, though time had become meaningless. The days blurred into one another, the light outside growing dimmer with each sunrise, as though the sun itself refused to touch the hollow. The house had begun to change. The walls pulsed faintly in the corners of his vision, and the floors seemed to shift beneath his feet, as if the manor were breathing. The whispers had become constant now, so many voices layered together that they no longer sounded human. They rose from beneath the floorboards, from the cracks in the walls, from the very air itself. Henry had stopped trying to block them out. He realized, at last, they were not simply haunting him. They were trying to tell him what had been buried. He began searching the house for answers, tearing through old trunks, prying open floorboards, reading what few documents remained untouched by rot. In his father's study, hidden behind a false panel, he found a small, leather-bound journal. The handwriting was Nathaniel's, precise, deliberate, the script of a man who believed in control above all else. Henry sat by the dying fire and began to read. The early entries spoke of construction details, accounts, and architectural notes, but soon the tone changed. Nathaniel wrote of the bargain and the price of permanence. He described his frustration with the land's resistance and his discovery of the voices beneath, calling them the keepers of the hollow. The entries grew erratic, the words scrawled in ink that looked darker than it should have. One line repeated again and again near the end of the journal: asterisk, the ground gives what it takes, and it takes what is built upon it. Asterisk. Henry read until the ink blurred before his eyes. The final entry was short, a single sentence written with a shaking hand: asterisk, we built over their graves, and now they live within our walls. Asterisk. He dropped the journal, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The whispers around him swelled, as if responding to his realization. He understood now, the Caldwells had not merely built a house on cursed land. They had built it upon the resting place of the dead, disturbing their sleep, binding their spirits to the foundation. Every brick, every stone, every inch of timber had been laid with the bones of the forgotten beneath it. Nathaniel had made a promise to the hollow, that the Caldwells would give it life, and in return, it would make their legacy eternal. But eternity had its own meaning. The land had kept its end of the bargain, and the price was blood. That night, Henry descended into the cellar one final time. The air was thick and wet, carrying the copper scent of decay. His lantern flickered weakly, throwing long shadows that twisted along the stone walls. The red seepage now ran freely, flowing like veins through the cracks. He followed it to the far corner of the cellar, where the floor had begun to sink inward, forming a shallow depression filled with dark water. It rippled faintly as he approached, though there was no breeze. When he knelt beside it, the surface stilled, reflecting his face, pale, hollow-eyed, and trembling. Then, the reflection changed. The faces of his family appear beside him in the water, his mother, his siblings, even Nathaniel. They looked as they had in his dreams, pale and silent, their eyes black and endless. Their lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. He reached out a hand, and the water shuddered violently. The voices erupted all around him, rising into a single, unified wail that shook the stone walls. Henry stumbled backward as the floor split beneath his feet, revealing a hollow cavity below. From the darkness came a stench so vile it made him retch, the scent of ancient rot and open graves. The shapes began to emerge, not whole bodies, but fragments, hands, faces, bones, all half buried in the earth, shifting as if alive. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering the same phrase over and over, "The debt must be paid." Henry screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the moaning of the house. He tried to run, but the air thickened around him like water. The lantern fell, its flame snuffed out as the red light from below filled the room. He didn't remember collapsing, only waking later in the great hall, lying on the cold floor. The house was silent again, deathly still. But the silence felt different now, expectant. He rose unsteadily, the air heavy with the smell of burning. The grand table stood as it always had, but upon it lay the family portraits, each one cracked and blackened. The paint around their eyes had blistered away, revealing empty sockets beneath. Henry's hands shook as he backed away, and then he saw it, fresh footprints, damp and red, leading from the hall toward the stairs. They were his. He followed them without meaning to, each step echoing faintly as if through a hollow chamber. The footprints led him to his father's study. The journal lay open on the desk, though he had left it closed. A single line had been added in new ink, though the pen lay dry beside it, "The house has taken what it was owed." Henry felt it then, a tremor beneath the floorboards, a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The portraits on the wall quivered, the frames rattling softly. He could hear breathing, close now, as if someone stood behind him. When he turned, he saw the shadows moving, forming vague shapes that resembled the outlines of his family. Their faces shifted in the darkness, and their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the same deep red that seeped from the cellar. They were not angry. They were waiting. He understood at last that the house had been feeding on them all along, keeping them within its walls so the debt could never end. As the night stretched on, the house began to awaken fully. The whispers grew louder, the walls trembled, and the ground beneath the foundation pulsed like living flesh. Henry screamed for forgiveness, for release, but the voices only echoed back his name. The last entry found in the journal years later, written in a hand that matched neither Nathaniel's nor the earlier entries, contained only a few words, smeared and half-legible. "We are part of it now." The house still stands, its windows empty, its doors chained shut by those who came after. Yet on stormy nights, when lightning strikes the hollow, the faint glow of candles can be seen flickering through the windows, and the sound of digging echoes from beneath the ground. They say the Caldwells never paid for what they built on. Now, the land has claimed them in full, and it will never stop collecting.